Now you've obviously been working at Amnesty for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about your roles, the roles you've held whilst working for the organisation, and a bit about your time with Amnesty?
Okay.
In particular.
I've been involved in Amnesty for 25 years, as you know. This is my 25th year, which is a bit amazing in some respects. So, and I've worked for Amnesty as a paid staff member for about 10 years. That involvement with Amnesty hasn't been consistent. It's gone on and off. I think, like most people, that you don't, your involvement sort of ebbs and flows. I guess in terms of roles, like I've obviously had activist roles. So I've run a school group when I was in high school. I had an involvement in university groups and have done that sort of side of Amnesty, and been involved in the sort of activist base. I volunteered in the Action Centre, or the office as it was, as well, and done that sort of work. So was that
the Hobart office, or
no, Brisbane? All my activism has been in Brisbane because that's where I grew up. So that's, or South East Queensland. That's there. And for me, I mean, Amnesty gave me a lot of opportunities in terms of being able to participate in things as a young person. So for one of the anniversaries, for instance, I did my first radio interview with Amnesty on the death penalty. It was around one of our anniversaries. If I sat down and worked it out, I could probably tell you which one, but it would have been I think it must have been the 30th one, that they ran a series, they profiled a series of different members on local Brisbane radio. And I was their youngest member at that point. And so they interviewed me through that, and it was pretty exciting because I was 14 or 15, so that was kind of exciting thing to do. And equally, to be able to volunteer in the office and develop skills around event coordination and see how things are worked out and coordinated was really, really useful. For me, Amnesty is the first activism that I did, or the first activist organisation I joined. So I joined it when I was really young. I would have been I was about 11, and my father had an involvement with it. So Amnesty had been something I'd grown up around, but not paid a vast amount of attention to. I just remember being dragged to all these local group meetings that were boring and went on forever, and I had nothing to do. But I read some reports particularly around the United States and death penalty when I was about 11. I was just horrified. The way in which kids are when the world's new and you're learning about stuff. And I couldn't believe that the United States would treat people in the manner in which they did when it came to execution and the death penalty. And then also reading about the United States, its support of governments in South America as well, and the support of governments that committed torture and that sort of stuff. And so I read that, and I guess for me the message that Amnesty had, which was both that these things are wrong, that it's not an acceptable way to treat people, but also that people can't just be outraged and sit there, that actually not only should you act, but you almost have a responsibility to act, is a really powerful message. And so for me, I think it would have been really demoralising to look at all those things as an 11-year-old and think there was nothing that I could do. Mm-hmm. But to have the message of, this is outrageous, and here's what you can do. And it's something as simple as writing a letter, or raising money so the research can be done, or all of that sort of stuff was really important to me and really powerful. And I felt that it provided, while I don't think there was any sort of deliberate targeting of people as young as me, for me it gave me an option to be involved in a way in which I could be involved.
From memory, how long have you been working with the organisation?
It's 10 years exactly. I became a member in March 2000, and it was when I was working in a big commercial law firm, and I wanted to focus on human rights because I'd studied that at university. And so I started volunteering in the New South Wales Action Centre. That was 10 years ago.
Sure. So you studied human rights at university.
Yeah.
What was? So it must have you must have had a spur, or it must have meant a lot to you to have entered a commitment of three or more years.
Well,
to study
I did law, so
Yeah.
I did human rights, a couple of human rights subjects as part of my law degree. So I did international law and human rights law, and really loved it then, and knew that was something that I was passionate about and that I wanted to work on.
Uh-huh.
And so that's when I thought that Amnesty would be a good place to start with that.
So did did it come into focus during your perhaps during your uni years?
Yeah.
I mean, young people, it's different for everybody, but they have a vague idea about where they want to end up as a career, and that classically it slowly comes into focus. When was the moment when it began to come into focus for you?
I think definitely when I was at uni and studying the subjects and reading the cases, and that was when I knew that I wanted to work in that area. And I've ended up working in the area in a volunteer capacity, which is great too. Yeah.
So that was your starting point as a volunteer?
Yeah. I started off convening the legal network in New South Wales. Yeah, and then moved to the branch committee and the national legal team and a few different things. So yeah.
Well, Mum and Dad brought me up in England with a sort of strong concern about justice and human rights. I remember starting writing letters to the paper when I was 12 on the issue of capital punishment, and I've been writing letters ever since. And then,
that's fabulous.
Yeah, and then during my teenage years, it was the period of decolonisation in Africa, and the whole thing around Southern Africa was coming up, and Kenya and so on, and the Federation of Rhodesia and Iceland. We used to have very interesting speakers coming through. Those are the days of sort of town hall meetings, and I was taken along by my parents and taught to heckle.
Where were you
This is Bath in England.
You were living in Bath?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And Bath is a very conservative city, so I was taught to hold my own fairly early on, given that most of the people there are totally reactionary. So when the paper we used to read, we got The Guardian by day and The Observer on Sundays. And in those days, shops weren't open on Sunday, and the guy in the centre of the city used to sell them in the street. He'd sit there with a big pile of all the papers, and you went up and took your pick. And when I came back from church or Quaker meeting, I always bought The Observer. It was my job. And then I'd take it home. And Sunday lunch was the only meal we weren't allowed to read at table. But I remember I used to read it under the table. So I remember the article, and I've still got a copy of the Penguin special that came out with it that Peter Benenson wrote, in which he had the case studies of 8 of the prisoners. Penguin specials in those days came out as little paperbacks with a special contemporary theme rather than, say, being a novel or something. And so it was a fairly slim book, but it highlighted 8 of the cases. I didn't get involved immediately. It was 2 years later I went to Oxford as an undergraduate, and they already had a group there, which I joined. And so you can sort of say my practical involvement with Amnesty really dates from there.
From your university days.
University days.
Yeah.
And the focus then was very much on letter writing, because it was the height of the Cold War. Each group was allocated 3 prisoners, and you adopted a prisoner. And so you had one from the communist bloc, one from the sort of American bloc, and one from the newly emergent non-aligned bloc. The Soviet bloc was basically the Soviet Union, the Gulag prisoners, and all the dissidents they locked up, just like the Chinese do today.
Sure. And
all the people in the satellite states. So there's a lot of that. And a lot of the people in Amnesty in those days were really there because of that. They were sort of strong anti-communists. They were often people from the Eastern Bloc who'd escaped. And an awful lot of them left when the Cold War ended. It was quite a slump at the time. It was interesting to sort of, when you look around the world today, to think about the countries we used to write to. just sort of examples like South Vietnam and South Korea, which were sort of American-backed dictatorships. And the non-aligned bloc on the whole hasn't sort of changed very much, but the Soviet bloc obviously has, and a lot of the time now, of course, we have to write to China rather than the Eastern Bloc, which is now sort of vaguely democratic, apart from Belarus.
Sure.
And so the idea was that you adopted the prisoner and you just kept writing and writing and writing to the authorities. And of course in those days they were also prisoners of conscience. It was very specific. And they were usually locked up because their politics or religion or a reason wasn't given. My mum and dad moved out to Malawi in Central Africa and lived out there for a long period of time. And they had a very maverick dictator.
You were with them, I imagine?
I visited we all went out and visited them, but we
Okay.
didn't live out there.
Okay.
They retired early to go and teach out there.
Sure.
And we all went out. And he used to have all sorts of people arrested. Mostly they never knew why. They would just disappear and word would spread quickly as it does, you know, where they were, and maybe a few months later they'd sort of re-emerge none the wiser. But the word amnesty used to make the presidency red, and he'd virtually double the sentence if Amnesty brought it up. But my parents used to get the information and then get a letter out with someone flying to London, because you couldn't send anything in the mail because of the censorship. So that was an example of a sort of in-between country. And I remember I was invited to the AGM of Amnesty in Germany fairly early on to talk about Malawi, because
This is German
Amnesty, because they had a prisoner in Malawi, and I was somebody who was known for having some expertise on it. So I remember staying in a hotel and being paid for to go to Germany and talk to them. I was teaching in England from 69 to 73, and I started an amnesty group at the school there. That's why I sort of got involved with schools.
What level of teaching?
It was a high school in the north of England.
Sure.
And I got the kids fundraising. We used to have a bread and cheese lunch on Fridays, and that sort of paid for the postage. But we used to do all kinds of practical things. We went and sat in a cage in the town square on one occasion. I still got the photo, old black and white photo, just for a whole day to sort of demonstrate what it was about. And we used to write presentations for church services, because the churches loved us to come around and have young people up there doing and saying something. So we go away for a weekend and put something together, and it involved them playing their guitar and speaking and a bit of street theatre. So that's the sort of thing I was doing with the school groups.
Uh-huh.
And since then I travelled a lot before I finally settled in Australia. And I linked up with amnesty groups in various odd countries during those years, and certainly met people who were dissidents.
I mean, my parents were both really politically active, so I mean, I was brought up in a household in which, you know, people were politically active, in which I went to peace rallies. My mother was a strong feminist. You know, my father was really involved in, obviously, in amnesty, but also in sort of other social movements. So for me, like, that was the environment in which I was living in. I think I was probably a precocious child as well, in that sort of area. I was really interested in everything that was going on, like Dad just left amnesty stuff lying around, so it was there. You know, like, it was kind of there. And I think also one of the things with children is, and having a daughter who's a little bit older now, is I have to admit I probably had a slight fascination with some of the reports. I really think for me, if they'd just been documents about how terrible the world is, then I would not have engaged with them. But they were documents about how terrible the world was and what I could do.
Yeah.
You know,
almost like a school publication about bullying or crossing the road, perhaps, for you at that age.
Yeah. So it was quite, and it was really, like, the message is really simple. I mean, the things these things were clearly bad, and they could easily be stopped if people in power decided to change their mind.
When I lived in Canberra, and I worked for a federal parliamentarian who was a member of the Parliamentary Amnesty Group.
What is the nature of the parliamentary?
Parliamentary Amnesty Group is quite a well-established group. It's cross-party. It's one of the few areas, you know, where they can work together, and they do a lot of really useful lobbying because they're members of Parliament. and they would have meetings, but it was the staffers who used to do all the work. So all the secretarial work I did, and I had to do endless photocopying and sending out mail and making all the arrangements and the press releases and so on. And that was interesting because I would sort of flip between the different political parties. So it was really interesting because of the sort of people I met and the things I could do, and the people from the national office would come up, and so we had a really good liaison with the people in Sydney. And then in '92, when my senator resigned, I came down here, and I took over the school's Amnesty group because there was one already at Friends School, and been sort of running that pretty much ever since. And then I set up the Amnesty Schools Network in Hobart, and that sort of rises and falls depending on contact with staff at the different schools.
During your formative years, even if your formative years go all the way to 20,
yeah.
Was there, looking back, do you think there was an indicator already in your conversations and your behaviour that was kind of an early warning sign to those around you that you'll probably end up in a human rights organisation? Did you show empathy for issues or fighting for human rights matters? Yeah,
for sure. I suppose when I was at college and at school, I was always involved in the student councils and stuff and things like that. So I suppose I was always concerned about issues that affected more than just myself. Concerned about working for broader issues and helping people. And when I was at uni, I volunteered in the student legal service as well. I guess that's, those kind of things were probably an early warning.
So it was kind of brewing over a period of time then.
Yeah, and definitely from when I was at school to uni.
The thing that I think really got me in was when I was in grade 8, which is the first year of high school in Queensland, so I wasn't quite 13. A year 12 girl got sent home for wearing shorts during a physics exam, and I've probably told you this, Kim, but this was a big thing for me. She got sent home during a physics exam. Her parents didn't support her, and she got sent home because she wore shorts in school colours, and that impacted her final year score, and I thought it was really unfair. So a friend of mine and we decided that we would wear shorts, knee-length shorts, because they weren't part of the uniform for girls, and we fully expected to get in trouble, and so we discussed it with our mothers, who backed us, and we just started doing it. Direct action. We just did it. And anyway, we wore them successfully for 2 weeks before the principal even noticed. And it was in fact my geography teacher, and he fessed this up to me later, was the reason that the principal actually even worked it out. Because he said to the principal, I think it's really good you've changed your mind on girls wearing shorts and that you're letting Amy and Peter in grade 8 wear them. I'm looking forward to when we actually update the uniform. And the principal had just not noticed, had absolutely no idea. And we got in heaps of trouble because the school, while it was a state school, really wanted to enforce a uniform. Did you
get your moment to convey to the headmaster what it was about?
I did. I mean, not that he was probably prepared to listen, and I think that was shown in one of his punishments. For me, there was a gender equity camp about something about exploring gender equity that I'd been selected to go on, and one of the first things they did to me as punishment was stop me from going on that camp, and I probably made my circumstance for me worse because I thought that was funny.
It is a bit ironic.
It was pretty ironic that, that when I was trying to make things better for girls, that they would actually block me from going on a gender equity camp, and I got in more significant trouble for thinking that was funny. But, I mean, on the upshoot, the reason why it was inspiring for me was that what happened was that we had the school investigated because they actually can't enforce uniform in the way in which they did. So my friend and I, we put together a complaint to the Ombudsman. The school was investigated with the help of our mothers, who were busy training us to be young activists. The school was investigated. It was found that they had treated us unfairly. that they couldn't enforce the uniform in the way in which it happened, and that the principal had to apologise for his treatment to me, which I think probably goes down as one of my more personally satisfying moments.
No, I can't think of anything, but one of the things I do remember is the first time I was arrested. It was for street speaking.
Sure.
Because growing up in Britain, street speaking was a favourite tool along with street theatre. And I'd inherited a loud voice from my father, who was a preacher. And on one occasion, we were street speaking in the centre of Manchester, and we used to do it regularly. And for some reason, we've never found out why, somebody high up decided we had to be arrested and put an end to it. Manchester's the home of free speech. And I remember that the first person to get arrested was an elderly clergyman who was a regular street speaker, and then we used to speak after him. And I remember saying to him, okay, people yell at me and say, oh, you're a sort of young hairy thing, you know, you'll grow up. And I said, what do they say to you when you're over 60? And he said, you're old enough to know better. and
These are the two versions of the rebuke.
I remember that because I knew I never would change, so there was nothing I could say to silly people who said, oh, you'll grow up.
Sure.
But it was funny talking to Alf, you know, who was over 60 and still at it, and
sure.
finding that those sort of empty-headed people still found something wrong with you at the other end of the age spectrum.
I think that my 17-year-old self would have said that I had different reasons for being involved in the human rights movement, and they were about more abstract things like justice and equity and, you know, a certain sort of, you know, indignation or rage at the unfairness of people in power and government. So I think what shifted it for me was when I had my daughter, because I think that perhaps my involvement in human rights and social change generally became motivated much more by empathy. I think that when you have like a partner or a child that you really care, especially children who are so vulnerable you really care about, you suddenly understand at some level and in a much more tangible way how terrible it would be to lose that child, and how vulnerable and interconnected we are with others.
Almost in your wider awareness, or even in your unconscious awareness, your child, I imagine, will become a symbol for many other people or groups, perhaps.
Yeah, and for me it made me feel more connected and dependent on others as well, in the sense that when I was 17, you're a bit bulletproof. You know, when you're 17, you just are. It's part of that age. So it was sort of hard to imagine being forced to do things or being that somehow vulnerable in which the way other people are. But when I have a child, I suddenly realised that I would do almost anything to protect that child. And all that someone would have to do to me to cause me great distress and angst, and I guess to get me to do other things, and maybe things I didn't want to do, would be to threaten that person. That's all, you know.
Yeah.
And I felt a lot of, you know, like you would see women who had lost their children, whose children had been disappeared, or who, you know, children were starving, and you just really, really notice that they, you know, I had more empathy for that. I'm more of an understanding how that might feel. So.
There was a quote on the recent BBC documentary about Amnesty that we saw about a week ago that was screened on SBS, where a leading activist said that Amnesty activists are typically people who are makers of mischief by nature. Do you consider yourself a mischief maker?
Oh yeah, I always used to use the term rat bag.
Rat bag?
Yeah. But my parents met each other through the peace movement. I grew up in it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So I've never known anything else.
Looking back over it's 10 years, you said?
Yeah, 10 years.
With Amnesty now?
Yeah.
What are some, off the top of your head, what are some memorable moments during that time?
Yeah.
Perhaps involving you, perhaps...
Yeah, I think there'd be lots. But, you know, there's a few that stand out for me, and some of them would be, obviously, you know, since I've had kids, having my kids involved in Amnesty. So, you know, when I took Jack to his first NAGM, and he was in there in his pram in this little I've Got Rights t-shirt, which Nicole, our national president, got from the US. So, you know, those kind of stand out in my mind.
Of an activist t-shirt.
Yeah, And then his photo was in the schools kit. This cute little photo of him in this Amnesty t-shirt when he was like 8 months old. So they probably stand out. But one of the biggest ones for me was working on a High Court intervention for Amnesty International Australia, and it was a refugee case, and essentially the outcome was that we managed to change the way that the law was being applied in Australia. By doing this High Court intervention. As a lawyer, you only get, you get to go to the High Court, not, maybe once or twice in your lifetime.
Bit of a thrill, really?
Yeah, so it was really amazing. And, to have barristers like Julian Burnside and Sarah Pritchard involved and to be working with them on how the Refugee Convention is interpreted in Australia and actually managed to change the law so that it helped refugees. So we travelled down to Canberra to go to the High Court, and that was all very exciting.
What are some highlights for you during your time at Amnesty? In the life of Amnesty, what are some highlights that in world events, perhaps, or in your own personal experience while you've been connected to Amnesty that have happened that are of note? Perhaps changes in the way governments or companies operated.
It's more seeing the changes in certain countries where you sort of felt despair for so long. Probably the collapse of the Soviet bloc, which none of us foresaw, was, we spent 1961 to 1989 writing letters to the Soviet bloc countries, and then suddenly they're all
dissolute.
The whole thing's collapsed.
Yeah.
And then a number of other countries we used to write to that were authoritarian regimes, particularly those in South America, places like South Korea, changes in Vietnam, because we used to write a lot of letters to South Vietnam up to 1975. And South Africa. South Africa was slightly different because some of the prisoners could be adopted by Amnesty, but others couldn't.
Yeah, I hear they were even...
Nelson Mandela, for example, was never adopted by Amnesty.
Yeah, that was the point I was going to make, yeah.
And, but that didn't matter because we still lobbied for him, within the anti-apartheid movement. I must have spent all the 27 years he was in jail demonstrating outside South African embassies all over the world, and they must have my picture on God knows how many of their files. And it was a great moment when I met him. He actually came to Canberra in 1991, and we met him there. Excellent. So that was a highlight.
Excellent.
And over the years I've met quite a few people who've been in jail. So I'd say there's no one highlight, but just sort of seeing some of the regime changes and meeting some of those individuals are high points.
I think I'd have to say, of course, the human rights achievements that we make are amazing, but I have to say one thing I didn't expect probably was to be involved for as long as I have been, and I think, I'll probably be involved in Amnesty for life. But also the friendships that you make. I've been involved in Amnesty in New South Wales and Tasmania, as I said, and been involved in national teams, and I've made friends pretty much across Australia. So that's really, that's really something that's really,
How do you see Amnesty morphing into the future, or how do you think it may evolve as it grows? Perhaps do you think
all organisations face growth problems and challenges, and I can't see into the future. I mean, the huge change, which has positive and negative side to it, is the communications revolution, the third industrial revolution. I mean, the difference between when we started in the days before fax and photocopying and mobile phones, and how long it took to sort of communicate news, and now it's instant, and we can be responding within 24 hours. And we can get people to the trials and move very, very fast, and that's made a huge difference. And that creates a problem because you get sort of an overload of information, and I think a lot of people probably get Amnesty appeals and simply can't keep up with it. One of the things I've noticed I'm a little bit sad about, because I think it's a mistake, is that so much of the time now we don't write letters, we get these e-petitions, and I
You
think
think
they're rubbish. I don't think they work. I don't think they take any notice of them.
You think there's still a place for the humble letter?
Yeah,
fact,
there is. I know
one.
that from politicians. They don't take any notice of these e-petitions. They're too easy. And I think that's a cop-out for a lot of us who just press a quick send button and we've done our bit. But having worked in Parliament and sort of sorted the politicians' mail, one handwritten letter or even hand-typed letter is worth 100 people, simply because they know that a lot of people think, oh, I should do something and don't do it. Whereas if they send an e-petition or an email or just one of those sort of form letters that you just sign, politicians chuck them in the bin. I know that. I've seen it. But that one letter that's... And it's one side, it's all you need. They haven't got time to take in more than that, just with the basic facts. And I know from talking to people who've worked at the UN that a lot of these countries that we write to, they're really embarrassed when somebody they thought they sort of successfully locked away, they're suddenly inundated with letters from all corners of the globe. They don't read them all, but they know they're getting them. And they are embarrassed by it. Some aren't, but Amnesty does have a certain amount of success, and that's those loopholes where politicians do get embarrassed. It's suddenly flooded with letters, and I know that because they've said so. So I think that I feel that we ought to put more emphasis back on the letters.
I think also, I mean, the thing I think that excites me as someone who is interested in the grassroots side of Amnesty and really values that, is that I actually think the social media and the phenomenon of things like Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it provide really good space for people to be able to engage in human rights debates and conversations, to be able to self-organise, to be able to get together. And we can see that happening in the Middle East. I mean, that's what's
Absolutely.
behind, at least, well, not behind, but that's been a real driving force of those revolutions.
It's a fantastic, beautiful driving force, isn't it?
It is.
To put it one way.
But like I can well imagine that that things will, shift. And I mean, I've had a long involvement. I mean, I've always, every paid job I've had of any significance, I've had email for. So I'm coming in of the generation of people that maybe aren't what you would call digital natives, but I certainly have had a long connection to the internet. And I know in some respects it was much more a space in which individual, ordinary people participated in certain ways. But we have to remember at the beginning with the internet is the people who had access to the internet, and also I think we shouldn't forget things like mobile phone technologies, how important they are.
Yeah, particularly with sorry to interrupt, but particularly the Amnesty app that's just come out.
Yeah.
This could be the start of some amazing doorways to...
Well, mobile phone technologies are really important because they're something that poor people can access. Whereas, I mean, we always hark back about the sort of how fantastic the internet was when the World Wide Web first started in about 93 and all that sort of stuff. But the one thing to remember then is that it was a much smaller community and a much smaller proportion of the world could access it. Whereas slowly there's been an expansion of it. But still, not everyone can access the internet. Like, I don't have the figures for it, but there's a huge proportion of the world who don't have access to this information, so we can't forget them. And that's where I think, say, for an organisation like Amnesty, some of those mobile technologies, whether they be mobile phones, whatever they evolve into, are also really important because people have sort of, in poorer countries, really used that well, and they're powerful tools for communication and organising as well.
What continues to inspire and motivate you to get involved with Amnesty International?
I'd say probably two things. The campaigns that we work on and the human rights issues that we work on. So from, refugees in Australia and enforcing making sure that their rights are upheld under the Refugee Convention and other human rights conventions. And, working on the Burma campaign, potentially having that hook up with Aung San Suu Kyi, which was incredible, to just achieving things in our own region in Tasmania, getting people involved and inspired in human rights work, and meeting lots of like-minded people and working with them towards a common goal, I suppose.
Sure. So you get a buzz out of this.
Yeah,
you get a buzz out of pushing the frontier of championing these various causes.
Yeah, totally.
Well, yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I think Amnesty's fundamental message is really, really hopeful, which is that that we can have a world in which people are treated decently, and that everyone can have a part in A, making that happen, and then B, ensuring that it doesn't go backwards. And I think that's a really hopeful message. I think that that's important. And I still believe that. Like, I still think we can live in a world, it's within our power as humans to live in a world in which basically most people have the opportunity of a decent life.